The woman they called too poor to marry would one day build something that made the whole town stand in line. In Pine Ridge, Montana, people had a way of deciding who mattered long before they ever learned a person's story. It was a town of neat porches, pickup trucks older than some of the high school seniors, and opinions that traveled faster than the wind rolling down from the mountains. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, as the sun stretched pale gold across Main Street, Ethan Carter stood outside the post office holding a letter that felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Ethan wasn't the kind of man people noticed twice. Mid-30s, worn work boots, a flannel shirt that had seen better winters, and the steady posture of someone who carried responsibility the way other people carried coffee. He worked as a carpenter just outside town, building fences, repairing barns, and fixing the quiet damage time leaves behind. But what truly defined Ethan Carter wasn't the calluses on his hands. It was the small girl who waited for him every afternoon at the edge of Pine Ridge Elementary. Lily Carter, 8 years old, with bright eyes and a backpack that looked almost too big for her shoulders. Since the day her mother passed away 2 years earlier, Ethan had learned something about silence. Not the empty kind. The kind that settles into a house after bedtime, when the dishes are washed, the lights are low, and a child asks questions a father wishes he had answers for. "Daddy," Lily had asked one night from the couch, her small voice wrapped in a blanket of hesitation, "do you think someday we might have someone else in our family again?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't want to. Because he was afraid of promising something the world might never give them. And yet that question stayed with him. Through long days measuring lumber. Through cold mornings starting his old Ford truck. Through quiet evenings when the house felt just a little too large for two people. So when a friend from church mentioned a small agency that helped people meet through letters and introductions, Ethan listened. Not because he believed in fairy tales, but because he believed Lily deserved a chance at something warmer than loneliness. Which was how, 3 months later, Ethan Carter found himself holding a letter addressed in careful handwriting. The name at the bottom read Hannah Whitmore. According to the agency notes, Hannah had been overlooked again and again. Families passed her by, men searching for someone younger, richer, more polished. One message in her file stood out, written bluntly by someone who had never met her. Too poor. Too plain. Not worth the risk. Ethan read that line twice, then slowly folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Because something about those words didn't sound like judgment to him. They sounded like someone who had been underestimated for far too long. And in a quiet town like Pine Ridge, the world was about to discover that sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the very ones who change everything. 3 days later, the bus from Billings rolled slowly into Pine Ridge beneath a pale afternoon sky, its tires crunching softly over gravel as it pulled beside the small depot that had not changed much since the 1960s. Ethan Carter stood a few yards away with his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching the door of the bus with the same steady patience he used when measuring wood before a cut. He had arrived 20 minutes early, not because he was eager, but because responsibility had taught him that important moments deserved quiet preparation. Behind him, the town moved at its usual gentle pace. A pickup rumbled past the gas station. Wind brushed across the wooden storefronts. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut. Pine Ridge was the kind of place where everyone noticed a stranger before the stranger even stepped off the sidewalk. The bus door opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. 2 college students stepped down first, laughing as they slung backpacks over their shoulders. Then an older man climbed off slowly with a suitcase that looked older than the road itself. Ethan kept his eyes on the door. Finally, a third passenger appeared. She stepped down carefully, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a small brown suitcase that looked almost too light to contain a life. Hannah Whitmore was not what the town would have expected. She wore a simple blue coat that had clearly been mended more than once, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a loose braid that the wind quickly tried to undo. There was nothing flashy about her. No expensive jewelry. No confident city polish. Just calm eyes that seemed to study the unfamiliar street with quiet caution. For a moment, she did not see Ethan. She stood beside the bus, taking in the town as if measuring the distance between what she had imagined and what actually stood before her. The driver closed the luggage compartment with a metallic clang and climbed back into his seat. Within seconds, the bus rolled away again, leaving behind the soft hum of the highway and one woman standing alone beside a suitcase. Ethan stepped forward. Hannah Whitmore looked up as his boots crossed the pavement. Their eyes met in the middle of that quiet Montana afternoon. Neither of them spoke immediately. Ethan broke the silence first. "Miss Whitmore." Hannah gave a small nod. "Mr. Carter." Her voice was calm, but carried the faint nervousness of someone who had traveled a long way with no guarantee of what waited at the end. Ethan gestured gently toward the truck parked near the curb. "It is about a 10-minute drive to my place." Hannah glanced toward the old Ford truck, then back at him. "I appreciate you coming." Ethan picked up her suitcase before she could protest. It weighed almost nothing. Not the weight of someone arriving with confidence. The weight of someone arriving with hope and very little else. As they walked toward the truck, the bell above the door of the nearby diner jingled. Two women sitting by the window turned their heads at exactly the same moment. Pine Ridge had already noticed. One of them leaned slightly closer to the glass, whispering something to the other. Hannah did not hear the words, but she noticed the looks. People often believed judgment had to be spoken out loud. In small towns it rarely did. Ethan opened the passenger door for her. "My daughter Lily is excited to meet you," he said. Hannah paused for a second before climbing into the seat. "I hope she will not be disappointed." Ethan closed the door gently, his voice quiet but steady as the wind moved across the street. "In this house," he said, "kindness matters more than anything else." And as the truck pulled onto the road, leaving Pine Ridge behind them, neither Ethan nor Hannah knew that the same town watching from behind those diner windows would one day stand in stunned silence because of the woman they were quietly judging today. The road out of Pine Ridge stretched in a quiet ribbon of asphalt between open fields dusted with late autumn gold, and Ethan Carter drove with the calm focus of a man who had spent most of his life on roads exactly like this one. The old Ford truck hummed steadily beneath them, its engine carrying the familiar rhythm of something that had been repaired more times than it had ever been replaced. Hannah Whitmore sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small suitcase resting near her boots, watching the landscape roll past the window as barns, fence lines, and distant hills moved slowly across the horizon. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that often appeared when two strangers understood that words should arrive carefully rather than quickly. Ethan finally broke the quiet. "Lily will still be at school for another half hour," he said, his eyes on the road. "Third grade. She likes art more than math, which I suppose makes her honest." Hannah smiled faintly, the expression small but genuine. "Art is honest," she replied. "Numbers can hide things." Ethan glanced toward her for a moment before returning his attention to the highway. "You like art?" Hannah hesitated before answering, as though measuring how much of herself belonged in this new place. "I like making things with my hands," she said softly. "Simple things. Wood, fabric, anything that can be turned into something useful." Ethan nodded slowly. In Pine Ridge, usefulness carried more respect than almost any other quality. The truck turned onto a gravel road that curved gently between rows of tall cottonwood trees. Their branches moved in the wind like quiet guardians standing over the land. A small white farmhouse appeared ahead, modest and sturdy, with a porch that looked out across nearly 2 acres of open field. The paint was not new, but it was clean. The fence posts were straight. The windows reflected the afternoon sun with quiet warmth. Ethan parked beside the barn and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Hannah studied the house with careful attention. It was not large. It was not impressive, but it felt steady, like something built to last rather than to impress. Ethan stepped out first and walked around the truck to open her door. "Home," he said simply. Hannah climbed down from the truck and looked around at the open land, the barn, the porch swing that moved gently in the breeze. "It is peaceful," she said. Ethan picked up her suitcase again and carried it toward the porch. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of pine wood and cinnamon from the small candle Lily liked to light on the kitchen counter. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, and a collection of drawings covered one section of the refrigerator door. Stick figures. Bright colors. One drawing showed 3 people standing beneath a yellow sun. Ethan noticed Hannah looking at it. "Lily made that last week," he said quietly. Hannah studied the drawing carefully. 3 people, she said. Ethan gave a small nod. "She is hopeful." Hannah did not respond immediately. Instead, she set her suitcase gently beside the staircase and looked once more at the drawing on the refrigerator. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. I will try very hard not to disappoint her. Ethan leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, his expression calm but thoughtful. Lily does not need perfect, he said. She just needs someone who stays. Outside, the distant sound of a school bus echoed faintly down the road, and in that quiet farmhouse a new chapter of 3 lives was about to begin. The sound of the school bus arrived like a small thunder rolling across the gravel road, its brakes sighing as it stopped near the Carter mailbox at the end of the long driveway. Ethan glanced toward the window while Hannah stood quietly beside the kitchen counter, unsure whether she should step outside or remain where she was. The bus door folded open, and a small figure hopped down onto the roadside gravel with the kind of energy only an 8-year-old could carry after a full day of school. Lily Carter adjusted the straps of her oversized backpack and waved quickly to the driver before turning toward the house. Halfway up the driveway, she noticed the unfamiliar truck parked beside the barn and slowed her steps. Children notice changes the way birds notice shifts in the wind. Her eyes narrowed with curiosity. Inside the house, Ethan opened the front door just as Lily reached the porch. She burst inside with a rush of cool autumn air and the faint scent of crayons and school hallways clinging to her jacket. "Daddy, I got a star sticker in reading today," she announced before stopping mid-sentence. Her bright eyes moved past Ethan and landed on the woman standing near the kitchen table. For a moment the room fell quiet. Hannah did not step forward. She did not force a smile or reach for a greeting. Instead, she waited with the same gentle patience Ethan had shown earlier that day. Lily studied her carefully, the way children sometimes examine strangers with surprising seriousness. Ethan knelt beside his daughter, so they were eye level. "Lily," he said softly, "this is Hannah." Lily blinked once, processing the name slowly. Hannah offered a small wave, careful and calm. "Hello, Lily." Lily looked back at Ethan. "Is she staying here?" Ethan nodded once. "If that is all right with you." Lily did not answer immediately. She slipped off her backpack and set it gently on the floor before walking a few steps closer to Hannah. The girl tilted her head slightly, examining the braid in Hannah's hair and the worn blue coat that looked like it had traveled many miles. "Do you like drawing?" Lily asked suddenly. Hannah seemed surprised by the question, but nodded. "I do. Very much." Lily's face brightened a little. "I have a whole box of markers," she said proudly. "Some of them still work." Ethan watched the exchange from the kitchen doorway, saying nothing. Hannah knelt carefully, so she was closer to Lily's height. "Would you like to show me your drawings?" Lily hesitated only a second before grabbing Hannah's hand and pulling her toward the refrigerator. "That one is the sunset from last summer," Lily explained, pointing to a page filled with bright orange and yellow streaks. "And that one is our house." Hannah studied each drawing with sincere attention, not the quick, polite glance adults sometimes give children. "You see colors very well," she said gently. Lily smiled wider now, the kind of smile that carried relief without needing to say it out loud. Ethan leaned quietly against the door frame, watching as his daughter began explaining every drawing on the refrigerator like a gallery tour. The late afternoon sun moved slowly across the kitchen floor while the wind outside brushed softly against the farmhouse walls. And in that simple moment between a quiet woman and a hopeful child, something small but important began to grow inside the Carter home. Not certainty, not perfection, just the beginning of trust. The first evening settled gently over the Carter farmhouse as the sky turned the soft copper color that Montana sunsets seemed to carry every autumn. Inside the kitchen, the smell of warm soup filled the air while Lily sat at the wooden table swinging her feet a few inches above the floor, carefully arranging a small collection of colored markers in a straight line. Ethan stood near the stove stirring a pot slowly, glancing now and then toward Hannah, who moved quietly around the kitchen as if learning the rhythm of the house one careful step at a time. She opened cabinets slowly, studying where everything belonged, not wanting to disturb a system that had clearly been built through years of routine between a father and his daughter. "You do not have to cook tonight," Ethan said calmly. "We usually keep things simple." Hannah shook her head gently. "Simple meals can still be good meals." Lily watched the exchange with curious eyes. "She cut the carrots better than you do," Lily announced matter-of-factly. Ethan raised an eyebrow in mock surrender. "That would not be difficult." The 3 of them sat down at the small kitchen table a few minutes later. The meal was simple indeed. Soup, warm bread, and a bowl of sliced apples. but the quiet comfort of the moment filled the room more than the food itself. Lily talked through most of dinner, explaining her school day in great detail. She described the class hamster, the new spelling list, and the fact that her teacher believed glitter glue was becoming a classroom emergency. Hannah listened closely, asking small thoughtful questions that made Lily sit a little straighter in her chair. Ethan noticed something he had not seen in a long time. Lily was not just talking. She was laughing. After dinner, Lily disappeared down the hallway and returned carrying a worn cardboard box nearly as big as her backpack. She set it on the table with dramatic seriousness. "These are all my drawings," she said. Hannah leaned forward with quiet interest as Lily began pulling out sheet after sheet of colorful paper. There were houses, trees, sunsets, and animals that sometimes had too many legs, but somehow still looked happy. One drawing made Hannah pause longer than the others. It showed a small farmhouse with 3 figures standing on the porch. The colors were bright and hopeful. Hannah traced the edge of the page gently with her finger. "You like drawing homes," she said softly. Lily nodded. "Homes are where people stay." Ethan said nothing, but the words hung in the kitchen air longer than any of them expected. Later that evening, after Lily had gone upstairs to brush her teeth, Hannah remained at the table studying the drawings that were still spread across the wood surface. Ethan returned from the sink and leaned lightly against the counter. "She has not shown those to many people," he said quietly. Hannah looked up. "She wants the house to feel full again." Ethan nodded once, his expression thoughtful. Hannah hesitated before speaking again. "There is something in the barn I noticed when we arrived," she said. "A workbench with old tools." Ethan followed her gaze toward the dark shape of the barn outside the kitchen window. "I do carpentry there sometimes," he explained. Hannah folded Lily's drawings carefully back into the box. "Would you mind if tomorrow I tried making something there too?" Ethan studied her for a moment before answering. "What kind of thing?" Hannah's voice carried the faint spark of a dream that had not been spoken in a long time. "Something useful," she said. And in the quiet farmhouse kitchen, Ethan had the strange feeling that the woman the world had called too poor might be carrying something far more valuable than anyone had yet realized. Morning arrived slowly over Pine Ridge with a pale blue sky stretching across the Montana hills and the cool scent of pine drifting through the open kitchen window. Ethan Carter had already left before sunrise, his old Ford truck rumbling down the gravel road toward a construction job nearly 20 miles outside town. The farmhouse was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the gentle scratching sound of Lily's crayons moving across a page at the kitchen table. Hannah Whitmore stood near the sink washing the last breakfast plate, watching the peaceful rhythm of the house settle into place. When she stepped outside a few minutes later, the air felt crisp and bright, the kind of morning that made the fields glow gold under the rising sun. She walked slowly toward the barn, her boots crunching softly over the gravel path, remembering the old workbench she had noticed the day before. Inside the barn, the smell of dry wood and sawdust lingered in the air like a quiet memory. Sunlight streamed through narrow gaps in the wooden walls, forming bright stripes across the floor. The workbench stood in the corner exactly as she remembered it, worn smooth from years of careful use. A small collection of tools rested along the wall, neatly arranged the way Ethan seemed to arrange everything in his life. Hannah ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the bench and smiled to herself. She opened the small suitcase she had brought with her and pulled out a folded cloth bundle. Inside were a few simple carving tools and a thin pencil worn down from years of sketches. The tools looked humble but familiar in her hands. She selected a small piece of scrap wood from a stack near the wall and studied its grain for a moment before beginning to work. The barn filled slowly with the soft rhythm of carving and sanding, the quiet sound of patience turning rough wood into something new. Hours passed almost unnoticed. By late morning, a small wooden box rested on the bench in front of her. Its design was simple but elegant, the corners smooth, the lid shaped with a gentle curve that followed the natural lines of the wood. Hannah brushed the last bit of sawdust from the surface and stepped back, studying it the way an artist studies a finished painting. Footsteps crunched outside the barn door. Lily appeared in the doorway holding a sandwich wrapped in paper. "Daddy said you might forget lunch," she announced proudly. Hannah laughed softly. "That sounds like something he would say." Lily walked inside and placed the sandwich on the bench before noticing the wooden box. Her eyes widened with curiosity. You made that. Hannah nodded. Lily lifted the lid carefully, running her fingers along the smooth edges. This looks like something from a store in the big city, she said with honest amazement. Hannah smiled gently at the comparison. It is just a box. Lily shook her head with the certainty only children possess. No, it is not. It is a treasure box. The girl carried it carefully back toward the house, as if transporting something precious. Later that afternoon, when Ethan returned home, he found Lily sitting at the kitchen table proudly placing her colored markers inside the wooden box. He looked from the box to Hannah, who stood quietly beside the counter. Ethan turned the box slowly in his hands, examining the smooth joints and balanced design. A slow, thoughtful smile appeared on his face. You could sell something like this, he said. Hannah shook her head gently. People do not usually buy things from someone like me. Ethan placed the box back on the table beside Lily's markers and looked at her with quiet certainty. Sometimes the world just has not met the right person yet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and somewhere deep in the quiet Montana afternoon, the first small idea of something much bigger than a wooden box had quietly begun. The idea began quietly, the way most meaningful things in Pine Ridge often did, without announcements or grand plans. Just a simple decision made at a kitchen table on an ordinary evening. Ethan Carter placed the small wooden box back in front of Lily, while Hannah Whitmore stood near the counter wiping her hands on a dish towel, unsure whether she should take his suggestion seriously or quietly set it aside, like so many other dreams she had once carried. Lily, however, had already made up her mind. You should make more of them, she said with the clear confidence of someone who believed problems were usually easier than adults made them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the box again under the warm kitchen light. The smooth corners, the balanced lid, the careful grain that Hannah had chosen from a piece of scrap wood. There is a small craft fair next Saturday in town, he said slowly. Hannah looked up immediately. A craft fair? Ethan nodded. The church hosts it every fall. Local people bring homemade goods. Jams, quilts, carved signs. Nothing fancy, but the whole town shows up. Hannah hesitated. I do not think people would want something made by a stranger. Ethan folded his arms calmly across the table. In Pine Ridge, people respect two things: hard work and honesty. You already have both. The next few days passed with a quiet kind of determination. Every morning after Lily left for school, Hannah walked to the barn where the workbench waited beneath the narrow beams of sunlight slipping through the wooden walls. She selected pieces of wood that Ethan had stacked carefully over the years and began shaping them one by one into small boxes, picture frames, and carved trays. The rhythm of sanding and carving filled the barn like soft music, and the growing row of finished pieces slowly lined the workbench. Lily became the unofficial assistant each afternoon after school, carrying finished pieces back to the house and proudly arranging them across the dining table. This one is my favorite, she would say, holding up a carved frame that curved gently around the edges like the outline of a mountain range. By Friday evening, nearly a dozen handmade pieces sat neatly wrapped in brown paper and stacked inside a wooden crate. Hannah looked at the small collection with a mixture of pride and nervous disbelief. What if no one buys anything? She asked quietly. Ethan closed the crate lid and lifted it toward the truck. Then we bring them home and Lily gets the nicest treasure boxes in Montana. Lily giggled from the porch. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright as the Carter truck rolled slowly into Pine Ridge. The craft fair filled the church lawn with folding tables and colorful tents, the smell of fresh pie and cinnamon drifting through the cool air. Ethan set the crate on a small wooden table near the edge of the field while Hannah arranged the pieces carefully across the surface. At first, people passed by with polite glances, stopping briefly to examine the woodwork before moving on to other booths. Hannah tried not to watch their reactions too closely. Then an older woman with silver hair paused in front of the table. She lifted one of the carved trays and ran her fingers along its smooth edge. Who made this? She asked. Hannah looked up quietly. I did. The woman turned the tray slowly in her hands before smiling in a way that carried quiet respect. Well, she said, this is the finest piece of craftsmanship I have seen here today. And as the first small crowd began to gather around the Carter table, Ethan noticed something he had been waiting for since the moment Hannah stepped off that bus. The town that once judged people quickly had finally begun to look closer. The silver-haired woman set the carved tray back on the table with a slow nod of approval, and that single moment seemed to change the rhythm of the entire morning. People who had been walking past only minutes earlier began to slow their steps. In a small town, curiosity often followed respect, and soon a few more visitors gathered around the Carter table to examine the handmade pieces more closely. One man lifted a wooden picture frame and held it up to the sunlight. Another woman turned a small jewelry box in her hands, testing the smooth hinge that opened with a soft, satisfying motion. Hannah Whitmore stood quietly behind the table, answering each question simply and honestly. She did not try to impress anyone. She explained the kind of wood she used, the hours spent sanding each surface by hand, and the small details she liked to carve along the edges. Lily Carter stood beside her like a proud assistant, carefully wrapping each purchased piece in brown paper and tying it with twine the way Hannah had shown her the night before. Ethan watched the scene from a few steps away, leaning against the tailgate of his truck with a calm expression that hid the quiet pride building inside him. Within 2 hours, nearly every piece on the table had been sold. The small crate that had once looked full now sat nearly empty beneath the table. Hannah looked at the last remaining wooden box as though she could not quite believe what had happened. "I did not expect this," she said softly. Ethan shrugged in the easy way that came from years of working with his hands. Good work usually finds its way. Just as they began packing the final items, a young woman wearing a denim jacket approached the table holding a camera. "Excuse me," she said politely. "My name is Claire Morgan. I write for a travel blog about small towns across Montana." Ethan straightened slightly, while Hannah listened with cautious curiosity. Claire lifted one of the carved trays and examined it with professional interest. "These pieces are beautiful," she said. "Do you sell them anywhere besides this fair?" Hannah shook her head. "No, I only just started making them again." Claire smiled thoughtfully. "Well, people who follow my blog love discovering handmade things like this. Would you mind if I wrote a small feature about your work?" Hannah blinked with surprise. "A feature?" Claire nodded. "Already. Taking a few photos of the table and the wooden pieces. Stories matter almost as much as the craftsmanship," she explained. "And this feels like a story people would enjoy." Ethan noticed the way Hannah looked down for a moment before answering. "If you think it would help someone appreciate handmade work," she said gently, "then I would be honored." Claire thanked them and promised to send a link once the article was published. By late afternoon, the craft fair began to quiet as tables were folded and people packed their goods into trucks and cars. Ethan loaded the empty crate into the truck bed, while Lily climbed into the passenger seat, still talking excitedly about every sale they had made. Hannah stood for a moment looking across the church lawn where the fair had taken place. The same town that had once whispered quietly about a stranger now carried small pieces of her work back into their homes. And though none of them realized it yet, somewhere beyond Pine Ridge, a simple article about a quiet woodworker was about to travel much farther than any of them had imagined. The article appeared 3 days later on a quiet Wednesday morning when the Montana sky hung low with pale clouds, and the Carter farmhouse carried the gentle calm of an ordinary day. Ethan Carter had already left for work before sunrise, and Lily Carter was finishing breakfast while flipping through a small notebook where she had started drawing new designs for treasure boxes. Hannah Whitmore stood near the kitchen window rinsing a coffee mug when the faint buzz of her phone sounded on the counter. She rarely received messages, so she wiped her hands slowly and glanced down at the screen. The message came from Claire Morgan. "The article is live. I think people are going to love your story." Hannah opened the link with quiet curiosity, expecting a simple paragraph about the craft fair. Instead, a full page appeared filled with photographs of the wooden trays, carved frames, and small boxes spread across the Carter table that Saturday morning. Beneath the images, the headline read "The Quiet Craftswoman of Pine Ridge," and the story described a woman who turned simple Montana wood into pieces that felt both humble and beautiful. Claire had written about patience, about handmade work, and about how sometimes the most meaningful craftsmanship came from the people the world had overlooked. Hannah stood silently reading the article while Lily leaned over her shoulder. "That is you," Lily whispered with wide eyes. Hannah nodded gently, but did not say anything else. By noon the phone buzzed again. Then again. Messages began arriving from people asking if they could order the wooden pieces they had seen in the photographs. Some came from other towns in Montana. Others came from places hundreds of miles away. By the time Ethan returned home, that evening the kitchen table held a small notebook filled with names, requests, and shipping addresses that Hannah had carefully written down. Ethan read through the list slowly before looking up at her with quiet amazement. "How many?" Hannah answered softly. 32 requests today." Lily clapped her hands together in excitement. "That means the barn is going to be very busy." The weeks that followed changed the rhythm of the Carter farmhouse in ways none of them had expected. Every morning Hannah worked at the barn workbench shaping wood into new designs while Ethan helped prepare materials in the evenings after returning from construction jobs. Lily became the official quality inspector, examining each finished piece with serious concentration before helping wrap them for shipping. Soon packages began leaving Pine Ridge in small brown boxes addressed to homes across the country. Months passed, and the small wooden creations that once filled a single crate at the church fair slowly grew into something larger. A modest online shop appeared. Orders continued to arrive. Yet inside the farmhouse, the most important things never changed. The kitchen table still held Lily's drawings. The barn still smelled of fresh sawdust. And the three people who had once been strangers now moved through each day like a family that had quietly grown stronger together. One autumn evening, nearly a year after Hannah first stepped off that bus, Ethan stood on the porch watching the sunset stretch across the Montana fields. Hannah joined him beside the porch railing while Lily chased fireflies across the yard. Ethan looked out across the land before speaking softly. "You know something funny?" Hannah turned toward him. "What is that?" Ethan smiled slightly as the warm light faded across the horizon. "They called you too poor." Hannah followed his gaze toward the glowing fields and the barn where the workshop lights still shone softly through the wooden walls. "Maybe. They were right," she said gently. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "They just did not understand what real wealth looks like." And as Lily's laughter drifted through the evening air and the quiet Montana sky settled over the Carter home, it became clear that the greatest thing they had built together was never just a business. It was a life worth far more than anyone in Pine Ridge had ever imagined.